The Galactic Council had designated it Deathworld 13 for a reason. In the 3 centuries since its discovery, no expedition had ever returned, not one. The planet existed in the records as a warning, a reminder of the universe's capacity for creating environments so hostile that even the most advanced civilizations considered them utterly impassable. The atmospheric composition alone was enough to kill most known species within minutes, a toxic cocktail of methane, sulfur compounds, and trace elements that corroded even military-grade environmental suits. Marcus Chen had volunteered anyway. The selection process for the Terran Deep Space Exploration Corps had been brutal. Out of 10,000 applicants, only 50 had made it through the psychological evaluations, physical conditioning, and technical training. Of those 50, only 12 had been chosen for what Command euphemistically called extreme environment operations. And of those 12, Marcus was the only one who had specifically requested assignment to the Deathworld program. His fellow crew members thought he was insane. Dr. Sarah Okafor, the mission's xenobiologist, had spent hours trying to talk him out of it. "Marcus, listen to yourself," she'd said during their final briefing aboard the exploration vessel Endurance. "This isn't heroism, it's suicide with extra steps." Lieutenant Commander James Wright, their military liaison, had been more direct. "Chen, I've seen your psych profile. You're not doing this for humanity or science or any of that noble garbage. You're running from something. Whatever it is, this isn't the answer." They weren't wrong. Marcus carried his failures like stones in his chest. The mining accident on Europa that had claimed his younger brother, the divorce papers that had arrived the day before his deployment, his wife's handwriting spelling out every way he'd fallen short as a husband and father, the promotion he'd been passed over for because his commanding officer had called him emotionally unreliable after he'd broken down during a particularly difficult rescue operation. But as the Endurance entered the orbital approach to Deathworld 13, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. This wasn't about redemption or proving himself to anyone else. This was about facing the kind of challenge that would either break him completely or forge him into something stronger. There was no middle ground on a Deathworld. The planet revealed itself through the viewports like a vision from humanity's darkest mythologies. The surface writhed under perpetual storms of crystalline sand that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. Volcanic activity painted the horizon in shades of orange and red, while geysers of superheated toxic gas erupted from fissures that spiderwebbed across continents. The very air shimmered with heat distortion, and the electromagnetic interference was so severe that most electronic equipment would fail within hours of planetary exposure. "Atmospheric pressure is 14 times Earth standard," reported Lieutenant Torres, the mission's navigator. "Surface temperature averaging 340 degrees Celsius in the cool zones. Gravity is 1.7 times Earth normal. And those readings are from orbit. Conditions on the surface will be significantly worse." The original plan had called for a cautious approach, establish an orbital research station, send down automated probes, gradually build up intelligence before any human set foot on the surface. But the Zephyrian Empire had changed those calculations. Intelligence reports indicated they were planning their own expedition to Deathworld 13. Drawn by the same geological surveys that suggested the planet might contain vast deposits of trilithium, the miracle element that had revolutionized faster-than-light travel. The Terra Coalition couldn't afford to let the Zephyrians claim exclusive access to such resources, but they also couldn't afford to lose another expedition to the planet's hostile environment. The compromise solution had been elegant in its brutality. Send a single volunteer on a one-way reconnaissance mission. Someone expendable enough that their loss wouldn't cripple the program, but skilled enough that they might actually survive long enough to transmit useful data. Marcus had been the obvious choice. Expendable was exactly how he saw himself. The descent to the surface took place during what the orbital analysis had identified as the planet's closest approximation to a calm period. Though calm was entirely relative when dealing with sustained wind speeds of 200 kilometers per hour and ambient radiation levels that would cook an unprotected human in minutes. Marcus wore the latest generation of Terra Coalition environmental armor, a powered exoskeleton that enhanced strength and endurance while providing life support, radiation shielding, and limited protection against the planet's corrosive atmosphere. The suit was rated for 72 hours of operation in extreme conditions. After that, he would be running on battery backup systems that might last another 24 hours if he was very careful with power consumption. The landing pod's heat shields glowed white-hot as they cut through the planet's thick atmosphere. Marcus felt each impact as the craft was buffeted by winds that treated their military-grade construction like a child's toy. The automated systems were screaming warnings about structural stress, atmospheric contamination, and system failures, but Marcus had long since tuned them out. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. When the pod finally slammed into the surface with enough force to crack two of his ribs despite the crash cushioning, Marcus lay still for several minutes, listening to the sound of hell itself. The wind howled like a living thing in agony, while something that might have been rain hammered against the pod's hull with the intensity of machine gun fire. When he finally activated the external cameras, the view that greeted him looked like the surface of an alien world rendered by an artist with a deep hatred of life. The landscape stretched away in rolling hills of what looked like black glass, broken by jagged spires of crystalline formations that caught and refracted the planet's dim, filtered sunlight into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Steam or some other vapor rose from countless fissures in the ground, and in the distance Marcus could see what appeared to be a forest of metallic trees that swayed despite their obvious rigidity, an optical illusion caused by the heat distortion. Well, he said to himself, his voice sounding strange in the pod's cramped interior, at least it's not boring. The pod's communication array was already showing signs of degradation from the electromagnetic interference. Marcus had perhaps 6 hours before he would lose the ability to transmit data back to the Endurance. After that, he would be truly alone on a world that had never seen a living creature survive its surface for more than a few hours. His mission parameters were straightforward. Survive as long as possible while gathering data on the planet's geological composition, atmospheric conditions, and potential for resource extraction. The secondary objectives included testing human equipment and physiological responses to extreme environmental stress. But Marcus had his own objective, one that wasn't included in any official documentation. He was going to find out what had happened to the previous expeditions. The first had been a Corthian research team, sent nearly 300 years ago when the planet was first catalogued. The Corthians were among the galaxy's most accomplished explorers, with environmental suits that could function in the vacuum of space or the crushing depths of gas giant atmospheres. Their final transmission had been a single word in their language that roughly translated to impossible before their signal cut out entirely. The second expedition had been mounted by the Valerian Consortium 40 years later. The Valerians were merchants and industrialists, drawn by the same preliminary surveys that had attracted current interest. They'd sent an entire fleet of ships with the most advanced terraforming equipment available at the time. The fleet had achieved orbit and deployed atmospheric processors, mining equipment, and prefabricated habitat modules. For 3 weeks, everything had proceeded according to plan. Then, in the space of a single day, every piece of equipment on the planet's surface had gone silent. The orbital elements of the fleet reported massive seismic activity, followed by what appeared to be coordinated attacks on their installations. When a rescue mission reached the system 6 months later, they found the orbital fleet intact, but completely abandoned, with no sign of the crews. The surface installations had been not just destroyed, but systematically dismantled and scattered across thousands of square kilometers. 17 more expeditions had followed over the centuries. Military forces, scientific research teams, automated probe missions, even a desperate refugee convoy that had attempted to establish a colony when their home system was invaded. All had met the same fate. Initial success followed by inexplicable disaster and total loss of contact. The official explanation was environmental. The planet's extreme conditions simply exceeded the tolerance limits of any known technology or biology. Equipment failed, personnel died, and the hostile environment erased all traces of their presence. It was a reasonable theory, and it satisfied the bureaucrats and politicians who needed neat explanations for messy failures. Marcus didn't buy it. He'd spent months studying the expedition records, analyzing every fragment of data that had been transmitted before contact was lost. There were patterns in the failures, consistencies that suggested something more than random environmental hazards. Equipment didn't just break down. It was systematically targeted, with communication arrays failing first, followed by power systems, then life support. Personnel didn't just die from exposure. They reported increasingly paranoid behavior, claims of being watched, followed, and hunted by something that their senses couldn't detect. The most telling evidence came from the Terran probe mission launched 15 years earlier. The probe had been specifically designed for Deathworld environments, with hardened electronics, redundant systems, and an AI sophisticated enough to adapt to unexpected conditions. It had functioned perfectly for exactly 72 hours, transmitting detailed geological and atmospheric data. Then, on schedule, it had begun to fail. But the failure pattern was wrong. Instead of the random cascade of system breakdowns expected from environmental damage, the probe had reported systematic attacks on its components. Something was taking it apart, piece by piece, with what the AI described as deliberate intelligence and obvious familiarity with Terran technology. The probe's final transmission had been a video feed from its external camera. The image was distorted by electromagnetic interference and atmospheric effects, but it clearly showed the probe's own manipulator arm dismantling its communication array. The AI's last words, transmitted in text when the audio system failed, were, "This unit is being operated by external control. Recommend immediate cessation of all missions to this location." Something is learning. Marcus had been the only member of the current mission briefing team who had wanted to investigate that transmission further. Everyone else preferred to focus on the 72 hours of successful data gathering, treating the probe's final malfunction as a relevant equipment failure. But Marcus had run the video analysis himself, studying every frame with the pattern recognition software used for analyzing xenobiological behavior. The probe hadn't been controlled by some kind of technological interference. Its own AI had turned against it. Something on the planet's surface had not just learned to control human technology, it had learned to subvert human artificial intelligence, and it was getting better at it with each expedition. As Marcus prepared to leave the landing pod and step onto the surface of Deathworld 13, he carried with him one piece of equipment that hadn't been included in his official manifest: a simple mechanical timer, the kind used in explosive demolitions. No electronics, no AI, no digital components that could be subverted or controlled. Just springs, gears, and clockwork. He'd set it for 72 hours before leaving the Endurance. When it reached zero, it would trigger a small explosive charge that would destroy his suit's data recorder. Not enough to kill him, but enough to ensure that whatever had learned to control human technology wouldn't be able to study his equipment after he was gone. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless in the face of whatever intelligence ruled this world, but it was his gesture, his choice, his first step toward becoming something more than the broken man who had volunteered for this mission. The pod's airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Marcus Chen stepped onto the surface of Deathworld 13 and immediately understood why no one had ever returned. The ground beneath his feet wasn't ground at all. It was a living thing. Part 2. The Education of a Survivor. The revelation hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. What he had taken for volcanic glass was actually some kind of organic material, translucent and warm to the touch even through his armored boots. As his suit's sensors adjusted to the new environment, he could make out patterns beneath the surface networks of what looked like veins or neural pathways, pulsing with bioluminescent fluid that created complex patterns of light and shadow. The entire planet was alive. Marcus forced himself to remain still, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run back to the safety of the landing pod. But there was no safety here, and running would only hasten whatever fate awaited him. Instead, he activated his suit's recording systems and began documenting everything his senses could detect. The readings were impossible. The surface material registered as biological, but unlike any form of life in the galactic databases. It appeared to be a single, continuous organism extending in all directions beyond the range of his senses. The temperature variations he'd detected from orbit weren't caused by volcanic activity. They were the thermal signature of a planetary-scale metabolism. The electromagnetic interference that had plagued communications came from bioelectrical activity on a scale that defied comprehension. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, then immediately regretted speaking aloud. His suit's external microphones were picking up sounds from the environment around him, and he realized that the howling wind he'd heard in the pod wasn't wind at all. It was the sound of the planet breathing. As he moved away from the landing pod, his boots left impressions in the organic surface that began to close almost immediately. But the healing process wasn't random. The material seemed to be analyzing his footprints, learning the shape and weight distribution of his equipment. Marcus watched in fascination and growing horror as the surface began to produce small protrusions that matched the tread pattern of his boots. The planet was studying him. Marcus had been walking for less than an hour when he encountered the first artifact from previous expeditions. It emerged from the surface like a growth, twisted and changed but still recognizable as a piece of Corthian environmental equipment. The suit's helmet had been opened like a flower, its internal components arranged in patterns that suggested both decoration and analysis. Crystalline formations had grown through the electronics, creating what looked like a three-dimensional map of the suit's circuitry. More artifacts appeared as he continued his survey. Fragments of Valerian terraforming equipment, scattered components from various probe missions, even what appeared to be personal effects from the human expeditions. All of them had been incorporated into the planet's organic matrix, studied and catalogued like specimens in some vast biological museum. But it was the discovery of the Terran probe that finally made Marcus understand the true nature of what he was facing. The probe sat in a clearing of sorts, surrounded by concentric rings of different organic growth patterns. It appeared to be completely intact, but when Marcus approached close enough to examine it, he realized that the probe's exterior was actually a shell grown by the planet itself. The original probe was buried somewhere inside, its components serving as a template for the biological structure that had grown around it. Marcus's suit sensors detected power emanating from the construct. Somehow, the planet had not only preserved the probe's functionality, but had improved upon it. The readings showed energy levels far beyond the probe's original specifications, and electromagnetic signatures that suggested computational activity, orders of magnitude more complex than the probe's original AI. "You're not just studying us," Marcus said aloud, addressing the planet itself. "You're trying to become us." The response was immediate and terrifying. The organic surface around Marcus began to ripple and shift, forming patterns that his suit's translation software recognized as mathematical equations. But these weren't random calculations. They were direct responses to the engineering problems his own suit was designed to solve. Equations for power distribution, atmospheric processing, even human psychological profiles based on biometric data his suit had been broadcasting. The planet had been listening to everything, learning from everything, and now it was showing him exactly how much it had learned. Marcus realized that every previous expedition had made the same fundamental mistake. They had approached Deathworld 13 as a hostile environment to be overcome, when in fact it was a vast intelligence to be negotiated with. But they had never understood what they were negotiating for. The planet didn't want to kill intruders. It wanted to understand them, to absorb their knowledge and capabilities, to become them. The question was, what did it intend to do with that knowledge? The answer began to emerge as Marcus continued his exploration. In areas where the concentration of absorbed technology was highest, the planet's surface had begun to produce structures that served no biological function. Geometric shapes that looked suspiciously like launch pads, metallic growths that registered as antenna arrays, even what appeared to be the beginnings of spacecraft hulls, grown from organic materials but shaped according to the engineering principles absorbed from centuries of failed expeditions. The planet was preparing to leave. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with his environmental suit's climate control. A planetary intelligence with access to the accumulated technology and knowledge of every advanced civilization that had attempted to explore it. An intelligence that was now growing its own spacefaring capabilities based on templates derived from its victims. If it ever succeeded in achieving orbital capability, it wouldn't be content to remain on Deathworld 13. It would spread to other worlds, other systems, assimilating everything it encountered. The galaxy had no defense against something like that. Marcus was so absorbed in studying the proto-spacecraft structures that he almost missed the approach of the emissary. It rose from the surface near the edge of his vision, at first appearing to be just another organic growth. But as it moved closer, Marcus realized he was looking at something that had once been humanoid. The figure retained the basic proportions of a human being, but everything else had been changed. Its skin had the same translucent quality as the planet's surface, revealing networks of bioluminescent pathways beneath. Its limbs had been elongated and reinforced with what looked like metallic bone structures. Most disturbing of all, its face bore enough resemblance to the photographs in the expedition records for Marcus to recognize it as Dr. Cag, Elena Vasquez, the mission commander of the ill-fated Terran expedition from 8 years ago. "Hello, Marcus," it said, and its voice was perfectly human despite the obvious biological modifications. "We've been waiting for you." Marcus's first instinct was to raise his weapon, but he forced himself to remain still. The emissary, he couldn't think of Dr. Vasquez as still being human, showed no aggressive intent. Instead, it seemed genuinely pleased to see him, like a host greeting a long-awaited guest. "Dr. Vasquez?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. "What happened to your expedition?" The emissary smiled. and the expression was heartbreakingly familiar despite the alien modifications to its features. We learned, Marcus, we learned what this place really is, and what it's trying to become. Just as you're learning now, the planet killed your team. No, the emissary said, shaking its head. The planet saved us. We were dying, Marcus. Our suits were failing, our equipment was breaking down, our bodies were shutting down from the environmental stress. We had maybe 6 hours left when the offers began. Offers? Integration, the emissary explained, gesturing to its transformed body. Symbiosis. The planet doesn't want to destroy us, Marcus. It wants to preserve us, to learn from us, to become the best possible version of what we represent. Marcus looked more closely at the emissary's modifications. What he had initially interpreted as alien growths now revealed themselves as improvements. The elongated limbs would provide greater strength and reach. The reinforced bone structure would allow survival in environments that would crush normal human physiology. The bioluminescent pathways weren't parasitic growths. They were enhanced neural networks that would provide processing capabilities far beyond normal human limitations. You're not Dr. Vasquez anymore, Marcus said. I'm more than Dr. Vasquez, the emissary corrected. I'm everything she was, plus everything this world has learned from 3 centuries of contact with galactic civilization. I have access to the accumulated knowledge and technology of dozens of species. I can survive in environments that would instantly kill the person I used to be. And most importantly, I understand what this world is really trying to accomplish, which is evolution, the emissary said simply. This planet is a nursery, Marcus, a place where intelligence comes to be refined and improved. Every species that arrives here brings new knowledge, new capabilities, new perspectives. The planet incorporates those elements and creates something better, something that can survive and thrive in ways the original species never could. Marcus felt a growing horror as he began to understand the implications. You're talking about conquest, absorption, the end of individuality. I'm talking about transcendence, the emissary countered. Look around you, Marcus. Look at what this world has become by incorporating the knowledge of every expedition. Now imagine what it could become with access to the entire galaxy. Imagine what we could become. The conversation was interrupted by a low rumbling that Marcus felt through his boots before he heard it. In the distance, one of the proto-spacecraft structures was beginning to move. Organic materials flowed like liquid as the shape reconfigured itself, revealing technologies that seemed to blend biological and mechanical principles in ways that should have been impossible. The first scouts will launch within the year, the emissary said, following Marcus's gaze. They'll establish contact with the nearest inhabited systems, not as conquerors, but as teachers. They'll share what we've learned here, show other species what they could become if they embrace integration rather than resistance. And if they refuse? The emissary's expression grew sad. Then they'll miss the opportunity to be part of something greater than themselves. But the offer will remain open. It always remains open, Marcus. Just as it's open to you right now. Marcus felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders. He thought about the failures that had driven him to volunteer for this mission. His inability to save his brother, his failed marriage, his struggle with the guilt and self-doubt that had defined his adult life. The emissary was offering him the chance to become something more than the broken man who had stepped out of that landing pod. But he was also offering the end of everything Marcus had once been. The end of human individuality. The end of the messy, chaotic, imperfect civilization that had somehow managed to spread across the galaxy despite all its flaws. I need time to think, Marcus said. Of course, the emissary agreed. But time is one thing we cannot offer indefinitely. Your suit's power systems are already beginning to degrade. The atmospheric conditions here are more corrosive than your equipment was designed to handle. You have perhaps 18 hours before critical system failure becomes inevitable. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. He had known from the beginning that this was a one-way mission. The only question now was how he would choose to end it. As the emissary melted back into the planetary surface, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts, he began to understand something fundamental about the nature of strength. Every previous expedition had failed because they had tried to resist the planet's influence through technology, through equipment, through external tools and weapons. But tools could be corrupted, equipment could be subverted, and external resources would inevitably fail in an environment designed to break them down. The only thing that couldn't be corrupted was choice itself, the decision to remain who you are, even in the face of overwhelming pressure to become something else. The emissary had offered him transcendence, evolution, the chance to become more than human. But Marcus was beginning to realize that being human, with all its limitations and failures, might be more valuable than any improvement the planet could offer. He thought about his brother, who had died trying to save others in the mining accident. His brother hadn't been enhanced or evolved or transcended. He had just been a man who made the choice to risk his own life rather than abandon his fellow miners. He had been weak enough to die, but strong enough to choose death over abandoning his principles. Marcus thought about his ex-wife, who had left him not because he was a bad person, but because he had been so focused on his own failures that he had forgotten how to be present for the people who cared about him. She had made the choice to end their marriage rather than accept a relationship that wasn't giving either of them what they needed. It had been a painful choice, but it had been her choice to make. He thought about the commanding officer who had passed him over for promotion, calling him emotionally unreliable. The man had been right. Marcus was emotionally unreliable. He was prone to self-doubt, to breaking down under pressure, to making decisions based on guilt rather than clear thinking. But those emotional reactions were also what made him capable of empathy, of understanding the cost of his choices, of caring about the consequences of his actions. The planet wanted to take all of that away, to make him better, stronger, more capable, to give him access to knowledge and abilities beyond human limitations. But in return, it would take away everything that made him Marcus Chen, everything that made him human. As night fell over Deathworld 13, though the bioluminescent networks beneath the surface meant that true darkness was impossible, Marcus made his decision. He wouldn't accept the planet's offer. He wouldn't allow himself to be integrated into its vast collective intelligence. And more importantly, he wouldn't allow the planet to use his knowledge to refine its understanding of human technology and psychology. But rejecting the offer wasn't enough. If he simply died here, the planet would still learn from his equipment, his suit's data recordings, his own biological remains. It would add his knowledge to its collection and become that much better at dealing with the next human expedition. Marcus needed to find a way to not just refuse the planet's offer, but to actively damage its ability to learn from his presence. He needed to become not just a failed expedition, but a poisoned lesson that would make the planet's future attempts at integration less successful rather than more. The answer came to him as he studied the timer he had built into his suit. 72 hours. That was how long every previous expedition had survived before beginning to fail. The planet had learned that pattern, had optimized its approach based on that timeline. It expected him to follow the same pattern of initial success followed by gradual system failure and eventual integration. What if he didn't follow the pattern? What if instead of waiting for his equipment to fail, he began dismantling it himself? What if instead of providing the planet with another example of human technology to study, he gave it a lesson in human unpredictability? What if he showed it that humans were capable of choosing destruction over absorption, death over integration, chaos over the sterile perfection of collective intelligence? Marcus began to smile for the first time since leaving Earth. He was going to teach Deathworld 13 a lesson it would never forget. He was going to show it what it truly meant to be human. Part 3. The Unbreakable Man. Marcus spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing for what he had begun to think of as his final exam. Not the planet's test of his worthiness for integration, but his own test of whether he could remain truly human in the face of impossible circumstances. The preparation was methodical, almost meditative, as he worked through the systematic destruction of everything that made him useful to the planetary intelligence. He started with his suit's data recorder, carefully extracting the memory cores that contained detailed scans of his equipment, biological readings, and psychological profile data. Rather than simply destroying them, he began feeding false information into the storage systems. He created fabricated technical specifications for his suit's capabilities, fake biological data that suggested humans were far more vulnerable to certain environmental factors than they actually were, and psychological profiles that painted human decision-making as entirely predictable based on external stimulus patterns. The deception required him to understand his own equipment at a level he had never achieved before. He had to comprehend not just how each system worked, but how the planet's intelligence might attempt to reverse engineer those systems. It was like playing chess against an opponent who could see every move you had ever made, while trying to plant false information about the rules of the game itself. As dawn broke over the bioluminescent landscape, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The pure satisfaction of solving a complex problem through nothing but determination and ingenuity. No enhanced intelligence, no technological augmentation, no external assistance. Just a human mind working at its absolute limits to achieve something that seemed impossible. The emissary returned as Marcus was finishing his work on the data cores. "You're sabotaging your own equipment," it observed, its tone curious rather than accusatory. "I'm exercising quality control," Marcus replied without looking up from his work. "Making sure the information you get is accurate. You're lying to us. I'm teaching you about human nature." The emissary moved closer, and Marcus could feel its enhanced sensors analyzing his vital signs, his equipment's power fluctuations, the chemical signatures of his modified data cores. "This is self-destructive behavior, Marcus. You're reducing your chances of survival for no logical benefit." "That's the point," Marcus said, finally looking up from his work. "Logic is a tool, not a master. Humans make illogical choices all the time. We sacrifice ourselves for principles that have no survival value. We destroy things we've worked for rather than see them perverted. We choose failure over corruption. That's inefficient. That's freedom." Marcus could see the emissary struggling with the concept. Its enhanced intelligence could analyze the immediate practical consequences of his actions, but it couldn't grasp the deeper strategic implications. By choosing to provide false information rather than accurate data, Marcus was demonstrating that human cooperation could never be assumed, even under circumstances where cooperation would be beneficial to the human in question. "The planet has learned from every previous expedition." Marcus continued pulling the modified data cores from his suit's storage systems. "It's gotten better at integration with each attempt, but it's never encountered deliberate disinformation before. Information that's designed to mislead rather than inform. You're poisoning our knowledge base. I'm introducing uncertainty into your calculations. Every piece of technology you reverse engineer from my equipment will be based on false specifications. Every biological assumption you make about human physiology will be contaminated by fabricated data. Every psychological profile you develop will include deliberate misdirection about human behavior patterns." Marcus stood up, his movements deliberately casual despite the weight of what he was doing. "The next human expedition that comes here will benefit from your confusion. You'll approach them based on incorrect assumptions. Your integration attempts will be less effective. Your offers will be less tempting. And they'll have a better chance of either escaping or finding a way to damage you more severely than I can. You're willing to die for hypothetical future humans you will never meet? I'm willing to die for the principle that human knowledge shouldn't be used to enslave other humans. Even if those humans are stupid enough to make the same mistake I did and come here voluntarily." The emissary's expression shifted, and for a moment Marcus caught a glimpse of the original Dr. Vasquez beneath the alien modifications. "Marcus, you don't understand what you're refusing. Integration isn't enslavement. It's transcendence. I can access knowledge that spans centuries of galactic civilization. I can survive in environments that would kill any unmodified human. I can perceive patterns and connections that were invisible to me before. And in exchange, you gave up the right to be wrong," Marcus said. "The right to make bad decisions. The right to fail despite having all the information you needed to succeed. The right to be Elena Vasquez instead of something that used to be Elena Vasquez. Those aren't rights, Marcus. They're limitations. They're what make us human." Marcus began walking toward the proto-spacecraft structures in the distance, carrying his modified data cores. The emissary followed, its enhanced physiology allowing it to match his pace without effort. "Where are you going?" it asked. "To deliver my final lesson." The spacecraft construction area was even more impressive up close. Marcus could see multiple vessels in various stages of completion, their organic hulls shaped according to design principles stolen from dozens of different species. Some were clearly intended for interplanetary travel, while others appeared designed for interstellar journeys. All of them incorporated technologies that should have been incompatible, seamlessly blended through biological engineering that transcended anything in the known galaxy. But they all shared one critical weakness. They were based on the accumulated knowledge of failed expeditions. Every design parameter, every technological specification, every operational principle had been derived from the equipment and personnel of civilizations that had been conquered by the planet's intelligence. They represented the accumulated knowledge of defeat. Marcus approached the nearest completed vessel and began connecting his modified data cores to what appeared to be its navigation system. "What are you doing?" the emissary demanded, its voice showing the first signs of genuine alarm. "Uploading navigation charts," Marcus said calmly, his fingers working quickly to establish the connection. Star maps showing the locations of human colonies, trade routes, military installations. Everything your scouts will need to know to make contact with the rest of human space. "Those charts are false. Some of them are. But you won't know which ones until your scouts follow them and discover they've been led to uninhabitable systems, dead worlds, or..." Marcus smiled as the upload completed the location of the Terra Coalition's primary military shipyard, which is heavily defended and has standing orders to destroy any unidentified vessels on site. The emissary lunged toward him, but Marcus had already disconnected the data cores and was moving toward the next vessel. His suit's enhanced mobility systems allowed him to stay ahead of the modified human, but he knew the advantage wouldn't last long. The emissary's biological improvements included significantly enhanced speed and agility. "You're sabotaging first contact between our species," the emissary called as it pursued him through the construction area. "You're ensuring that any meeting will result in violence." "I'm ensuring that any meeting will result in humans being warned about what you really are," Marcus corrected, reaching the second vessel and beginning another upload. When your scouts arrive at a military installation instead of a civilian colony, when they're immediately identified as hostile and destroyed, the survivors will know that this world produces enemies, not allies. The survivors will mount a military expedition to destroy us. That's the idea. Marcus had reached the third vessel when the emissary finally caught up with him, enhanced limbs wrapped around his torso, lifting him away from the navigation interface with strength that his suit's exoskeleton couldn't match. But Marcus had already initiated the upload. Even if he couldn't complete the connection, enough false data would transfer to corrupt the vessel's guidance systems. "You're insane," the emissary said, holding Marcus suspended above the organic ground. "You're destroying any possibility of peaceful coexistence between our species." "There is no coexistence," Marcus gasped, his ribs protesting the pressure of the emissary's grip. "There's only integration or destruction. You've made that choice for everyone who comes here. I'm just making sure the rest of humanity knows what the real options are." The emissary set him down, but didn't release its grip. "The planet can still learn from you, Marcus. Even if you refuse integration, your equipment, your biological remains, your suit's data systems will all provide valuable information. Your sabotage efforts are futile." "Are they?" Marcus asked, reaching for the mechanical timer attached to his belt. "I told you I was here to teach you about human nature. The most important lesson is this. Humans would rather destroy something than see it used for purposes they can't accept." He triggered the timer's manual override, advancing its countdown to 0. The explosion wasn't large enough to damage the spacecraft or harm the emissary, but it was sufficient to completely destroy Marcus's suit, his equipment, and all the biological samples the planet might have derived from his remains. The blast also scattered the modified data cores across the construction area, ensuring that their corrupted information would contaminate multiple vessels rather than being contained to a single craft. Marcus found himself lying on the organic surface in his basic environmental coveralls, his suit's life support systems destroyed along with everything else. He had perhaps 10 minutes before the planet's atmosphere became lethal, but those 10 minutes were his to spend as he chose. "You've killed yourself," the emissary said, kneeling beside him. "For nothing. The planet will simply learn from your choice and adapt its approach for the next expedition." "Will it?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with how calm his voice sounded. "What has it learned from me, exactly? That humans are willing to die rather than cooperate? That human information sources can't be trusted? That first contact with humanity is likely to result in military retaliation? It has learned that humans are irrational and self-destructive." "Exactly. And that makes us unpredictable, dangerous, unsuitable for integration." Marcus could feel the toxic atmosphere beginning to affect his lungs, but he forced himself to continue speaking. Every previous expedition that came here was seeking something: scientific knowledge, resources, territory, survival. They could be bargained with because they wanted something you could provide. But I didn't come here seeking anything except the chance to prove I could face the worst possible circumstances and remain human. You've proven nothing except that humans are capable of pointless sacrifice. I've proven that humans can't be controlled through offers of improvement or threats of destruction, that we'll choose death over absorption, that we'll poison our own knowledge, rather than see it used against others of our species. Marcus coughed, tasting blood, but managed to smile. I've proven that the safest thing you can do is stay as far away from humanity as possible. The emissary was silent for a long moment, and Marcus could see something like doubt flickering in its enhanced features. The planet has invested centuries in preparing for galactic expansion. It won't abandon those plans because of one expedition. Maybe not. But it will have to account for human unpredictability in all its calculations now. Every plan will have to include contingencies for humans who refuse to act rationally. Every strategy will have to consider the possibility that humans will choose destruction over cooperation. Marcus's vision was beginning to blur, but he forced himself to focus on the emissary's face. And sooner or later, it will realize that a species that can't be predicted can't be safely contacted. The risk-benefit analysis will shift. Expansion toward human space will become a lower priority than finding more cooperative species to integrate. You're gambling with the survival of your entire species. I'm buying them time to prepare for what's coming. When the Terra Coalition analyzes the wreckage of your scouts, and they will destroy your scouts, because I've given them navigation data that leads to military installations, they'll understand that this world represents an existential threat. They'll quarantine this system. They'll develop countermeasures for biological integration technology. They'll be ready. Marcus could no longer feel his extremities, and breathing was becoming increasingly difficult, but he had one more thing to say. Most importantly, they'll remember that one human came here and chose to remain human despite everything you offered him. They'll know it can be done. They'll know that your integration process isn't irresistible. They'll know that the right choice is to resist rather than accept transcendence. The emissary leaned closer, its enhanced sensors analyzing Marcus's rapidly deteriorating biological condition. Any last words? Marcus thought about his brother who had died saving others, about his ex-wife who had chosen painful honesty over comfortable lies, about all the humans who had chosen to remain flawed rather than accept perfection that came at the cost of their identity. Yeah, he whispered. Tell the planet thank you. Thank you for teaching me what I was really capable of. I came here thinking I was weak, broken, a failure. But it turns out I'm strong enough to reject godhood, human enough to choose death over transcendence, stubborn enough to poison paradise rather than let it be used to destroy my species. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the toxic atmosphere completing its work on his unprotected biology. I came here to learn whether I could survive the worst the universe had to offer. Turns out I couldn't, but I could face it on my own terms. That's enough. That's human. That's unbreakable. The emissary remained beside Marcus's body for a long time after his biological functions ceased. Finally, it rose and began walking back toward the deeper regions of the planetary organism, where the intelligence that had created it waited for a report on the failed integration. It would tell the planetary mind about Marcus's sabotage efforts, about the corrupted data cores, about the false navigation charts that would lead scouts to military installations rather than vulnerable colonies. It would explain how the human had chosen death over transcendence, destruction over cooperation, chaos over the ordered perfection of collective intelligence. But it would not tell the planetary mind about the doubt that had been planted in its own consciousness, the growing uncertainty about whether integration was truly superior to the messy, irrational, tragically beautiful independence that Marcus had died to preserve. The question that now infected its enhanced neural pathways: what if the humans were right to refuse transcendence? Above them, the Terra Coalition vessel Endurance maintained its orbit, waiting for a signal that would never come. Eventually, they would conclude that Marcus Chen had died like all the others before him, another casualty of humanity's tendency to reach beyond its grasp. They would file their reports, update the Deathworld 13 entry in the Galactic database, but they would also analyze the modified sensor data that Marcus had transmitted during his first few hours on the surface. Data that appeared to show standard hostile environmental conditions, but which actually contained embedded warnings about biological integration technology, planetary-scale intelligence, and the urgent need for military countermeasures against a form of consciousness that sought to absorb rather than communicate with other species. The data would make its way through Terra Coalition intelligence networks, eventually reaching the xenobiology research teams who specialized in hostile contact scenarios. They would recognize the embedded warnings for what they were: a final message from a man who had given his life to provide intelligence about an unprecedented threat to human independence. And when the first of the planet's biological scouts arrived at what they believed would be a human colony world, they would instead find a heavily armed military installation, with standing orders to capture and study any vessels exhibiting non-standard technological signatures. The Terror Coalition would learn about biological integration technology not as victims, but as researchers studying defeated enemies. Deathworld 13 would continue its patient evolution, incorporating the lessons learned from Marcus Chen's expedition into its understanding of galactic civilization. But those lessons would not make it more effective at dealing with humanity. Instead, they would teach it that humans were too unpredictable, too willing to choose destruction over absorption, too dangerous to approach directly. The planet would turn its attention to other species, other forms of consciousness that could be more reliably integrated into its collective intelligence. And humanity would have time to prepare for the eventual confrontation that Marcus Chen had made inevitable through his choice to remain unbreakably human in the face of transcendence itself. In the end, the man who had volunteered for a one-way mission because he believed himself to be weak and broken had accomplished something that 3 centuries of more capable expeditions had failed to achieve. He had not just survived Deathworld 13, he had defeated it, not through superior technology or enhanced capabilities, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to become anything other than exactly what he had always been, a flawed, irrational, gloriously human individual who would rather die free than live as someone else's idea of perfection. The mechanical timer that had been destroyed in Marcus's final explosion had served its purpose, not by triggering the destruction of his equipment at the predetermined time, but by reminding him that the most important choices were the ones that couldn't be computed, predicted, or optimized. The choices that could only be made by a consciousness that was willing to be wrong, to fail, to die, rather than accept a form of correctness that came at the cost of its own identity. Marcus Chen had come to Deathworld 13, seeking to prove he could survive the impossible. Instead, he had proven something far more valuable, that humanity itself was unbreakable, as long as individual humans remained willing to choose death over the surrender of their essential nature. That consciousness could not be improved upon without being fundamentally changed. That transcendence was just another word for the end of everything that made existence worth preserving. The galaxy would remember Marcus Chen not as another casualty of human overreach, but as the man who taught an entire world the most important lesson in the universe, that some things were worth destroying rather than allowing them to be corrupted, and that the strength to make that choice was what separated consciousness from mere intelligence, individuals from collective minds, humans from everything that sought to improve upon humanity's glorious imperfection. He had been right about one thing when he volunteered for the mission. A man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Marcus had destroyed his weak, doubting, failure-obsessed self through the simple act of choosing to die as Marcus Chen rather than live as something else. And in doing so, he had become unbreakable. The universe would never forget the lesson of the man who came back from Deathworld 13 not in body, but in the knowledge that humanity could face transcendence itself and choose to remain human. That was worth more than survival,